By sunrise, 13 wagons of wet corn were parked outside the county co-op, and every one of them was already beginning to spoil. The dealers said 6 weeks. The bank said there would be no more extensions. And then an old farmer named Wade Mercer walked to the back of his machine shed, pushed aside a tarp that had been collecting dust since 1984, and opened the one thing half the county had spent 28 years laughing at: a row of dead grain dryers. Or at least, that was what people thought they were. In March of 1981, Wade's neighbor dropped the first one there, a rusted farm fan's burner assembly from a batch dryer that had cooked its own wiring and warped the blower housing so badly the service shop in Hannibal refused to touch it. The dealer told the neighbor the repair made no sense. New parts were unavailable, labor would cost more than the unit was worth, and the clean answer was to buy a new dryer. So the neighbor did what farmers in that part of northeast Missouri had been doing with impossible equipment for generations. He hauled it to Wade Mercer's place. He did not call first. He did not ask permission. He just backed his flatbed into the lane beside Wade's hedgerow, unloaded the burner assembly with a chain hoist, left a feed sack full of bolts beside it, and drove away. Wade found it that evening, standing in the mud like a stubborn animal that had wandered in from somebody else's trouble. Most men would have been annoyed. Wade went inside, got a yellow paint marker, wrote the neighbor's name on the housing, and covered the control box with a coffee can to keep the rain out. That was the beginning. To understand why people kept bringing dead equipment to Wade Mercer, you need to understand the kind of farmer he was. Farmed just under 600 acres along the Salt River bottoms. Corn, soybeans, a little winter wheat when the rotation called for it, and enough hay ground to keep his brother-in-law's cattle from eating him broke. His grandfather had started with mules and a 2-bottom plow. His father had been the first Mercer to own a combine. Wade was the first one who could wire a dryer panel without calling somebody from town. He never called himself an electrician. He never called himself a mechanic. He would not have used the word engineer, though he had the habit of thinking like one. He was a farmer, the way some farmers understand rain before it hits the roof. He could look at shelled corn in his palm, roll it once between his fingers, and know within 2 points what the moisture meter would say. He could hear a dryer fan from 50 yards away and tell whether the blades were loaded with dust, whether the bearings were heating, or whether the motor was losing a leg. He knew the smell of corn that was merely wet, corn that was beginning to heat, and corn that had crossed the line into ruin. That kind of knowing is not impressive in a brochure. You cannot put it in a glossy sales folder. You earn it in October at midnight with a headlamp on. When the rain is coming sideways and a bin full of corn is warming from the inside. Wade had a machine shed behind his house, a long, low building with tin siding, a gravel floor, a workbench made from old bridge plank, and a 1940s Logan lathe he had bought from a closed vocational school in Quincy. He had a drill press, a welder, a shelf full of old contactors, a cabinet of relays, pressure switches, motor starters, sail switches, bearings, belts, grease seals, ceramic igniters, and every paper manual he could rescue before somebody threw it in a burn barrel. He also had notebooks. Every dryer, auger motor, blower, burner, gearbox, stir-rater drive, and control panel that arrived at Wade's hedgerow got a notebook. The cover carried the owner's name, the date it arrived, the make, the model if he could find one, and the failure as best as the owner understood it. Inside, Wade wrote down the truth, not what the owner believed was wrong, not what the dealer had guessed over the phone, the truth, one measurement at a time. He recorded wire colors, amperage draws, bearing numbers, belt lengths, pulley diameters, gas orifice sizes, fan blade pitch, grain depth, burner cycling behavior, thermostat drift, and whether the last man who worked on it had known which screws mattered and which screws only held the cover on. By 1985, there were 9 pieces of equipment along the hedgerow. By 1990, there were 21. By 1996, there were 36. Most of them looked terrible from the road. Rusted blower housings, sun-faded panels, auger heads with bent guards, old dryer columns with patched screens, motors sitting on pallets under tarps. If you did not know what you were looking at, it was easy to see a junk pile. That was the whole problem. Almost everyone saw a junk pile. Wade saw a map of the county. That batch dryer had belonged to the Lammerts before they lost the river ground in 1983. That axial fan had come from the Pritchard farm after a lightning strike in 1988. That gear reducer had spent 19 harvests on a bin north of center, and the reason it failed was not age, but a misaligned auger that had been eating its own coupler for 5 seasons. Each piece was a record of how people farmed, how they cut corners, how they survived bad years, and what broke first when money got tight. The 1980s had made a lot of things break. Land values fell. Operating loans tightened. Interest rates punished men who had borrowed against yesterday's optimism. Farmers delayed repairs they would have made in better years. They ran old dryers one more season, then one more, then one more after that. Dealers stopped carrying parts for equipment they no longer wanted to support. New systems were cleaner, faster, safer, and profitable to sell. But new systems cost money. In Wade Mercer's county, plenty of farmers did not need a new system. They needed the old one to run long enough to get through another harvest. So the dead equipment kept arriving. Wade never promised speed. He had his own farm, his own harvest, his own family, and his own machinery to keep running. But in the evenings, after supper, he would walk back to the shed, open a notebook, and work through one dead thing at a time. He cleaned burner heads. He rewound small motors when they were simple enough. Machined bushings when the part number no longer existed. He built test cords. He replaced cracked insulators. He found old manuals through auction boxes, retired servicemen, and phone calls that began with, "You don't know me, but I think you might have a diagram I need." When a piece was repaired, he called the owner. If the owner had moved away, he tracked him down. If the owner had died, he called the son. If the land had been sold, He found whoever had inherited the equipment and asked what they wanted done with it. He did not sell the repaired machines. He did not part them out unless the owner gave him permission. He did not make a business out of other people's broken years. That mattered to Wade. The equipment had names attached to it. In 1998, a dealer named Carter Blaine drove out to Wade's farm. Carter owned the largest grain equipment outfit between Hannibal and Kirksville. He sold dryers, bin packages, legs, conveyors, sweeps, controllers, and service contracts. He was smart, efficient, and good at numbers. His shop was clean. His trucks were lettered. His invoices were printed. His parts room had barcode labels and a counterman who knew how to tell a farmer politely that obsolete meant obsolete. Carter had heard about Wade's hedgerow for years. He had also lost a few sales to it. The farmer would come in, hear the price of a replacement burner, rub his jaw and say, "I might let Wade look at it first." Carter hated that sentence. Not because Wade was stealing business. Wade barely charged anything. That was what made it worse. Wade existed outside the model, and Carter trusted the model. So on a windy April afternoon, Carter parked his white service truck near the Mercer house and asked Wade if he had a minute. Wade made coffee. Carter sat at the kitchen table and explained that he was expanding his service department. He wanted to build a rebuild program for older dryers and auger systems. There was demand. He had customers. He had insurance. He had facilities. Was somebody with Wade's hands. Carter spoke carefully. He had rehearsed it. Wade listened. Then Wade asked what would happen to the equipment already along the hedgerow. Carter said that was actually the first problem they would need to solve. The units were exposed, undocumented from a liability standpoint, and most of them had no clear customer status. The clean approach would be to haul them off, recover whatever salvage value they could, and start fresh with a proper intake process. The kitchen went quiet in a way Carter did not understand yet. Wade looked out the window toward the hedgerow. Then he said, "Those belong to people." Carter nodded. He said he understood the sentiment, but after 15 or 20 years, sentiment could not be the operating principle. In practical terms, most of that equipment was scrap. Wade looked back at him. "I know who everyone belongs to." Carter smiled less after that. No deal was made. A week later at the feed store, Carter told a couple of men that Wade Mercer was a good old boy, but he was sitting on a museum of junk and pretending it was a service department. That line traveled faster than rain on hard ground. Wade heard it. He said nothing. He went back to the shed. "Now we need to talk about the fall of 2009, because that was the season that changed what the hedgerow meant." The year had been wet from the start. Spring planting dragged on. Low spots drowned out. The river got out twice. Soybeans stood yellow in fields that should have been green. Corn tasseled unevenly, then finished late, and by October the crop was still carrying moisture like it had been grown in a bathtub. The elevator was taking corn at 25 and 26%. Some loads came in higher. Farmers who had bins were drying around the clock. Farmers who did not have bins were waiting in lines that stretched onto county roads. Propane trucks were running like ambulances. Every dryer in the county was being pushed past the kind of hours its manufacturer imagined. Wet corn does not wait politely. It heats. It molds. It turns from crop into liability while you are still making phone calls. On the morning of October 18th, Harold Kessler's grain dryer died. Harold farmed 800 acres with his 2 sons. He had cut 200 acres of corn before the rain came back, and he had 27,000 bushels sitting in bins that needed air and heat. The dryer was a mid-1970s continuous flow unit with a burner system that had been patched so many times the control panel looked like a family tree. At 4:12 in the morning, the fan motor tripped out. Harold reset it once. It tripped again. By daylight, the motor had seized, the burner had locked out, and the corn in the wet holding bin was already beginning to warm. Harold called Carter Blaine's dealership. The service manager was honest. They could get a compatible motor in 10 to 14 days, if the supplier actually had one. A new dryer package could be quoted immediately, but installation was weeks out. Every crew was booked. Every emergency was real. Harold said, "I don't have weeks." The service manager said, "Nobody does." That was true, and it solved nothing. Harold hung up, sat in his pickup for nearly a minute, and then drove to Wade Mercer's farm. He found Wade in the shed with a mug of coffee cooling beside a notebook and an auger gearbox opened on the bench. Harold explained the problem too fast. Wade let him run out of breath. Then he asked 3 questions. What horsepower was the motor? What diameter was the fan? Single phase or 3? Harold answered. Wade walked to a filing cabinet, pulled open the second drawer, and took out a notebook with a faded blue cover. The notebook belonged to a dryer that had arrived in 1991 from the old Beeler place. The Beeler dryer had been considered worthless then. The bin had come down in a windstorm, the dryer column had twisted, and the owner had sold the good parts at auction. But Wade had saved the blower assembly, the motor mount, the contactor box, and the fan, because the damage had missed the one part everybody else ignored: the air system. Wade had rebuilt the motor in 1997. He had replaced the bearings again in 2004 because they felt rough. He had run it on a test stand every other year after that, because old motors that sit too long can surprise you in the wrong direction. He told Harold he could have air moving by night. Harold stared at him. "What do you want for it?" Wade said. "I want your corn not to cook in the bin." By 9:30 that night, the old Beeler fan was bolted into Harold Kessler's dryer frame with an adapter plate Wade cut from 1/4-inch steel. The motor pulled clean amperage. The fan ran true. The burner cycled. Warm air moved through 27,000 bushels of wet corn. Harold's crop survived. But Harold was not the story. He was the first warning. Over the next 16 days, the county began to lose machines faster than Carter Blaine could send trucks. A Sturator drive stripped itself bald on a bin east of Perry. An unload auger gearbox cracked a case near New London. A burner control board failed at the Hines farm. Two axial fans burned windings after running day and night in cold rain. Then, on the first Saturday in November, the Markham County Co-op lost the south dryer. That was the darkest point. The co-op had 13 wagons and 9 semis waiting with corn, too wet to store. More was coming from the fields, because the forecast showed 3 dry days, and every farmer with a combine was trying to steal those days before the weather closed again. The south dryer failure looked small at first, a cycling problem, a burner that would light, run, cough, and shut down. The control panel showed nothing useful. The co-op manager called Carter's dealership, then a second dealer in Columbia, then the manufacturer's support line. The answer came back in clean, professional language. The burner management module was obsolete. A replacement panel could be engineered. Lead time was 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks in November, with wet corn stacked outside, is not a timeline. It is a death sentence with stationery. By noon, men were standing in the co-op office saying very little. That is how farmers sound when the options have run out. Nobody was yelling, because yelling would have meant somebody still believed force could change physics. The corn was wet. The dryer was down. The weather window was closing. The county was watching a year of work begin to rot in public. Someone finally said Wade Mercer's name. Carter Blaine was standing there when they said it. Nobody looked at him. That made it worse. Carter drove to Wade's farm himself. He did not bring a sales pitch this time. He brought the failed module, 3 photographs of the burner train, and a face that had lost the clean confidence it used to wear. Wade set the module on the bench and looked at it for a long time. Then he went to the filing cabinet. The co-op's south dryer had been upgraded twice over 30 years. Wade knew the first upgrade because he had helped install it in 1982, back when the co-op still paid farmers in checks from a drawer and kept parts in coffee cans. He knew the second upgrade because the old panel from that job had ended up on his hedgerow in 1995. Most people had looked at that old panel and seen obsolete controls. Wade had kept the wiring diagram. He had also kept the flame sensor, the gas valve relay, the air proving switch, and the transformer, because none of them cared what decade the sticker came from if the circuit was right. The new module had failed. The old system could be made to run safely if the safeties were preserved and the sequence was rebuilt by hand. That sentence sounds simple, only if you have never stood beside a grain dryer. A dryer is not a campfire with a fan. It is a controlled machine that moves heat through grain without burning the crop, poisoning the air, or turning a bin site into a headline. If you bypass the wrong safety, you are not clever. You are dangerous. Wade did not bypass safeties. He rebuilt the sequence. He and Carter worked through the afternoon and into the night. Carter fetched tools. Wade traced wires. The co-op manager held a flashlight and did exactly what he was told. At 1:40 in the morning, Wade closed the panel, stood back, and told them to start the fan. The big motor came up first, A deep metal roar that rolled through the yard. Then the burner lit. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the flame held through the night. By Monday, the co-op had dried enough corn to clear the wagons, then the semis, then the new loads that kept arriving under a sky that looked like wet newspaper. That was when Carter Blaine finally understood what he had been looking at for all those years. The hedgerow was not junk. It was not nostalgia. It was not an old man refusing to modernize. It was a county-scale memory system, built out of failed equipment, handwritten notes, and one farmer's refusal to confuse replacement value with actual value. A week after the co-op dryer came back online, Carter returned to Wade's kitchen. This time he did not talk about hauling anything away. He said, "I called it scrap." Wade poured coffee and said nothing. Carter said, "I was wrong." Wade sat down across from him. Carter looked toward the shed window. That old panel kept a co-op running. Wade said, "The panel helped." Carter nodded because he heard the correction. The panel helped. The notebooks helped. The parts helped. But what kept the co-op running was not any one piece of metal. It was the understanding that connected them. That winter, Carter and Wade came to an arrangement that did not look like a contract because neither man wanted it to. When Carter's dealership faced an emergency the normal system could not solve fast enough, Carter called Wade. When Carter took old equipment in on trade, he let Wade look at it before it went to scrap. When Wade needed a part Carter could get, Carter got it at cost, or below, and pretended he had mispriced it, because that was easier for both of them than gratitude. Over the next 7 harvests, Wade's hedgerow helped save 23 systems. Not all of them were dramatic. Some were just motors. Some were bearings. Some were switches, adapters, old diagrams, or the exact memory of which model year had a left-hand thread on a shaft that looked like every other shaft, until a man ruined it with a wrench. But every one of them mattered to somebody, and Wade kept writing. By the time Wade turned 76, the shelf over his workbench held 84 notebooks. They were not pretty. Some had oil fingerprints. Some had corn dust in the spine. Some had pages where rain had bled the ink just enough to make the numbers look tired. But together they held a practical history of how a farming county kept obsolete equipment alive when the official answer was replacement. A state extension specialist eventually heard about the notebooks and asked if Wade would let him photograph them. Wade said he could photograph the pages if he put everything back in order. That was Wade's condition. Order mattered. A broken thing is easier to dismiss when its story has been scattered. Wade died in 2017 in late September, 3 weeks before harvest started. He was 81. On the bench the day he died was a Sturator gearbox from the Brenneman farm, opened cleanly, tagged in pencil, and waiting for a bronze bushing he had been making on the Logan lathe. The last line in his notebook read, "Check shaft wear before final fit. Do not trust eye." His son Miles finished the gearbox. It took him 6 weeks, not because the repair was impossible, but because grief makes even simple measurements heavier. Miles had worked beside his father since he could stand on a milk crate and sort bolts, but there is a difference between knowing how a man works and becoming the person who must finish what he left open. He found the bushing blank in a drawer. He found the shaft tolerance in a manual Wade had saved from a dealer clean-out in 1989. He cut the bushing on the Logan lathe, ruined the first one by hurrying, made the second one right, and wrote both facts in the notebook because that was the rule. Write what happened, not what makes you look smart. The gearbox ran. Miles called the Brennemans. They brought pie when they picked it up, because farm people sometimes pay in the currency that is available when money is not the point. Miles still runs the shed. The hedgerow is smaller now. Some machines have finally reached the end of what can be understood out of them. Some were returned. Some became donors with permission. But the notebooks are still there, and new ones have been added. The newest notebook has a different handwriting. Miles's daughter, Clara, came back from college in 2021 with a degree in agricultural systems technology and a dislike for people who say old farmers do not understand computers. Winter, a neighbor brought in a modern grain dryer controller that kept shutting down on a fault nobody could reproduce when the technician was present. The dealer wanted to replace the controller. The manufacturer blamed the sensor harness. The farmer was ready to spend $6,000 because uncertainty is expensive when corn is wet. Clara watched the fault logs for 2 evenings. Then she asked if the shutdowns happened only when the unload auger started. They did. Ag traced it to an undersized neutral in a panel that had been temporarily wired during an expansion 12 years earlier, and proved that the controller was not failing at all. It was protecting itself from a problem upstream. The repair cost $218. The farmer paid her more than that. Clara opened notebook number 97. On the cover, she wrote the farmer's name, the dryer model, the date, and one line her grandfather would have liked. Fault was telling the truth. We were asking the wrong question. That is the point of the whole story. Not that old equipment is better than new equipment. It is not. Not that every dealer is greedy or every farmer with a shed is wise. That would be too easy, and it would be false. The point is that replacement is often a business decision pretending to be a technical conclusion. And understanding is the thing that tells the difference. A hedgerow can look like junk from the road. A notebook can look like clutter on a shelf. An old motor can look finished because the part number no longer exists. But in a farming county, where weather can turn patience into loss overnight, the difference between scrap and salvation is sometimes one person who took the time to learn what a broken thing still was. Wade Mercer spent most of his life doing that quietly. The county only noticed when the corn started to spoil.